Welcome back to another episode of Timebreaker Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel.
And I'm Anthony.
And for special episode number 12, we are rounding out the Dark Knight trilogy with The Dark Knight Rises that coincidentally also came out in 2012. How funny is that? Just going to be giving our thoughts. You know, this movie has been out forever. It's one of the greatest trilogies of all time. So we're going to talk about spoilers. And if you haven't seen this trilogy, I don't know what the hell you're doing here. Go watch it.
I mean, and if you watch the last two, and then you're still sitting here on the third one, you're like, I'm not going to watch these.
Right.
Then, yeah, like,
If you're just here for the show because you want to hear us talk about movies you've never seen, that's totally fine, too. I'm okay with that. But, this is the third film in Christopher Nolan's trilogy. It's the biggest in scope, coming off the heels of The Dark Knight. It wasn't his movie he made right after that, so he made Dark Knight, and then he made Inception, and then he made this film. So you could say this film had like a lot of anticipation going up to it because he had made like arguably two perfect films, or two of his like most acclaimed films right before this one. So, you know, everybody was super hyped for this one, you know, to see where they would take it. Heath Ledger had already passed, so the Joker wasn't involved with this one. So everything involved in this movie, I'd have to say, is in the shadow of The Dark Knight. And I feel like that's this movie's reputation. You know, this isn't everybody's favorite. This is probably most people's least favorite, and it's a really popular thing to hate on The Dark Knight Rises. I think unfairly because they're comparing it too much to The Dark Knight. But what are your general thoughts on the movie?
I genuinely enjoy it. I mean, if we're comparing it from The Dark Knight, of course this is. I mean, it's not The Dark Knight, and there's no simple way to talk about why. There's something iconic. There's something original. I mean, and even 4 years later when this movie released, like, The Dark Knight was already like nostalgic to a point. I mean, it had beloved scenes, and it was, you know, one of the most perfect sequels ever made, on top of just being a perfect movie in general. So, I mean, it had a lot to live up for. I mean, the fun thing about this movie, because even though its reception is, good to really good, is that this movie's scale, like, just jumps immensely from The Dark Knight. Like, it is a very expensive looking movie, and it's just grand in scale for what it's trying to do, and for that I totally give it props.
Yeah, 100%. That's like the only one of the aspects where I'd say this movie like tops The Dark Knight in those aspects is the scale, you know, the ambition with this film. This was the last one, you know, pulling all stops, just, you know, how many extras they have, you know, for those like city brawls, or how many police cruisers. Like, everything is practical here because it's Chris Nolan, and it's just everything is in camera, and you just see how much bigger the story is. You know, with the first two, especially Batman Begins, is really self-contained, and I feel like we're talking about like parts of Gotham, you know, aspects here or there, you know, certain, you know, streets or whatever. But this one really feels like it's taking Gotham to the city level and making almost Gotham a character. You know, I know like the mood of Gotham has been in it before, but just like having everybody involved in this film, like, you can really feel it with the size of the movie.
Yeah, and it really kind of expands on how The Dark Knight made Gotham like a character, and this one just kind of expands it and like brings those themes and ideas home. And, you know, Bane as a villain, I enjoy him. He's not in the film that much, and I think that's why a lot of people are gripey about it. Like, he's probably only in 30 minutes of the whole 2 hours and 44 minutes of the runtime.
I mean, yeah, that's true. You could also kind of say the same thing about Batman, too. Like, it takes a really long time for Batman to show up because this takes place, like, I think in the story 8 years after The Dark Knight or whatever. And Bruce Wayne is a much grizzled, different man than he was before. And it takes a while for him to like get back into the swing of things. And that's another aspect where I do enjoy this film and how it takes its approach compared to like The Dark Knight or even Batman Begins. Is I feel like personally this is much more of a Bruce Wayne movie than a Batman movie, almost in the way that Iron Man 3 is more of a Tony Stark movie than an Iron Man movie.
Yeah, we know how much we love Iron Man 3.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some really good things in this movie. I really liked Commissioner Gordon again, bringing it home, giving that good
Oh yeah.
performance. And his monologue at the beginning kind of just sets up the entire movie, which is also like really cool when like just one snippet of dialogue really just goes to show where the story's going to be going.
Yeah, it really sets the mood. You know, we have that like tiny fade in scene of him at like the funeral, like the memorial service for Harvey Dent, and how they have this huge lie that he was a good guy, even though we know from the previous movie that he most definitely wasn't. But then we transition into, I guess, the true opening sequence, which it's not the Dark Knight opening sequence, but it does rival it, and it is quite epic. And you get to see the scale of this film within that first scene with the plane heist with Bane. Great villain introduction, just like the Dark Knight, and how practical it is. You know, they were blowing up these planes, flying them in the mountains, and you can see it. Like, and the entire sequence is also shot on IMAX, and you get to see this, the size of the aspect ratio and the definition of the cameras, and it's a beautiful sequence in my opinion.
Yeah, and fun fact, this was the second IMAX film I'd ever seen, followed by Superman Returns in 2006. So this was, 6 years later, I went and saw another IMAX movie.
Interesting, interesting. While we're on the topic of IMAX, I want to talk about it in this film. So I rewatched it last night, and before, like when I'd rewatch it, I'd had some issues with the IMAX sequences because they are jumpy in certain sequences. But when I watched it again and was like actively paying attention to it, I actually kind of appreciated how Nolan commits to like almost complete scenes using the IMAX camera. You know, almost every action sequence is shot exclusively with the IMAX, and just using it for those wide shots, and it just breathes a fresh, breathes some fresh life into films and filmmaking, and it's almost like his signature move to shoot these films like this. And I think he like upped the mastery of using the cameras from The Dark Knight, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's kind of just a trend you see with Nolan. I mean, you look at The Dark Knight, you look at The Dark Knight Rise, you go to Interstellar and all these other movies, and just the way he uses IMAX just gets better and better, better and better. And then we get to Tenet, where, you know, by the time Tenet's now out, I feel he has mastered the camera. He knows what it can do. He knows how to handle it, and yet he's still like trying to innovate in the way it's being used. And looking at the Dark Knight to the Dark Knight Rises, the Dark Knight was just it was like a test. It was a test to see if this was even viable. Because, and fun fact, then he didn't use it at all for Inception. He chose to forgo IMAX cameras for Inception, which I don't know. It's kind of a real shame because the definition and the scale you get with IMAX, I feel, could have been used really well with Inception. But that's regardless of the point. But in this movie, especially if you watch it on a 4K disc like I have, those IMAX sequences, I mean, you're jumping from probably, I believe he shot it on 35 millimeter to 70 millimeter, and the 70 millimeter IMAX, and it's just the amount of detail on the screen is just insane. And I went and saw The Dark Knight in IMAX, and I finally popped my 4K of The Dark Knight Rises in, and I was just blown away with how crystal clear the IMAX sequences were.
Yeah, and even on my Blu-ray, like I can tell, like there's just something about the IMAX cameras with the definition, the aspect ratio, and I feel like even the way it takes in colors, like it's just a little bit more vibrant, and it just adds. It's a beautiful image, and I just love how he incorporates it, and I wish more filmmakers would as well.
Yeah, and the sad part is that for a lot of people, I feel that people are getting more into IMAX now because of movie ticket prices increasing anyway. So they're like, if I'm gonna go see it in a premium format. I still think things like Dolby Cinema, Dolby Atmos, I think those are actually where people are going because I think they're more used to like those names. Like they hear like Dolby Cinema, Dolby Atmos, and they go, well, I know what Dolby is, and they just go to that. And I still think that IMAX is still like a very select group of people go to it. Now, granted, it's a bigger group, though, I would feel, nowadays.
Yeah, it's definitely gaining in popularity, and if you haven't checked out an IMAX screening, if you have one near you, I really recommend you just go try it out, especially for one of those big cinematic movies, like Dune that's out right now, or any other, like Eternals is coming out, Spider-Man, like some of these big blockbusters, just like seeing it on IMAX is just a whole nother level. But going back into the film, and it once it has that opening sequence, it kind of slows down, and we get like this, this mellow tone with, Bruce. He's like out of his element, and he's just like holed up in his house, and Alfred's just taking care of him, and you're just watching everything like crumble around him, how he hasn't moved on, and we get a very like introspective look into Bruce Wayne's character that I feel like we just haven't touched on in the other films.
It's like a very broken Bruce Wayne, one that, had to give up his life of crime fighting, and because of Rachel's death, he's kind of just sitting back and looking at the world, but not really participating in it. I mean, I believe even in the film they say that they haven't seen him in like years. So, I mean, the character's just kind of locked himself in, and then, a chain of events brings him back out. But talking about that opening sequence, it kind of, I mean, now that we've seen No Time to Die, it's kind of in that same instance where like it gets started immediately, and then the villain kind of just disappears because there's no better way to introduce them than to just throw it in at the beginning.
Yeah, he doesn't show up until like a couple. Is it the stock market raid?
I believe the stock market is when he shows back up again.
Right, and that's also when Batman first shows up, and so yeah, they do use the villain sparingly, but I do feel like Bane, while his screen time is limited, he has such a presence. Tom Hardy knocked it out of the park, especially with the effects they did with the mask and the voice, and giving him stilts in his shoes to make him look massive. He just has like a presence, and like that scene where he just puts his hand on Ben Mendelsohn, he's like, "Do you feel in charge?" It's just chills.
Yeah, he really just incorporates the role and just owns it. And when Batman goes up against him, I mean, at first you're just like, okay, maybe Batman's got this, but the way that sequence is shot, I mean, it like, so when he first enters, the camera's kind of at level, but then I feel like the camera's like angled more to make Bane look bigger than he is, to give this feeling that Batman is, small, and that he's not going to win this fight when they're fighting in the sewers.
Right, and I mean, if you think about it, physicality wise, Batman and Ra's al Ghul were pretty even matched in Batman Begins, and Joker wasn't a physical villain, he was more of a psychological villain, so that's who he was taking on in that aspect, and he could easily overpower Joker in hand-to-hand combat. But Bane was the first time we saw in this franchise really a villain that he couldn't really compete with physically, and to watch him just, no matter like if you're like outsmarting him, because Bane's still a really smart guy, was trained in the League of Shadows, he has the wit too, but Batman just physically just has stands no chance against him, and you just see this ultimate beatdown in the sewers, and it's just kind of shocking because literally Bane wins like halfway through the movie, and then you're like, we still got another hour or half or so to go. Like, what is going on?
Yeah, and it was a super interesting take that Nolan took here because, at least marketing wise, they didn't even like infer that this was a Bruce Wayne movie. I mean, they showed Batman in the trailers, and then to literally have Batman out of commission like 55 minutes into the movie, I mean, it was a good artistic choice, and they kept it under wraps too for the most part.
Yeah, and since he gets kind of put out of commission, we do have some new characters that kind of fill that void. We introduced Catwoman, played by Anne Hathaway, and I think she does a great job in this film. She's a great like actress. How Catwoman can like play the room, be what she needs to be in order to survive the situation, and I think she brings a lot to the table. And then obviously Chris Nolan saw something in that, because then he brought her back for Interstellar.
Just going into her actual character, I feel like her character needed to be in this movie. There was no way this movie could have just been Bane and Batman for Nolan to tell the story he wanted to. He needed characters on the ground because he,
right,
has Batman decommissioned 55 minutes in, and he uses Gordon, and he uses her, and then he uses Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character to also just fill in what's going on in Gotham and show this terror that's happening. And Catwoman is pretty much in the know it about what's about to happen, and she's excited for it. And then when it happens, you kind of see her start to go, "Oh, this isn't really what I wanted."
Yeah, definitely. And to go to Joseph Gordon-Levitt, newcomer to the franchise as well, but also coming off the heels of working with him on Inception, I think he does a great job. He plays a young, like, optimistic cop, kind of like how Gordon was in Batman Begins, and but he goes that extra mile. Gordon stayed within the confines of the law, but Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, he wants to go and do things on his own way, and that's where we can see that kind of link, because he knew who Bruce Wayne was. He knew he was Batman right off the rip, because he's got that similar past. I think it was a good idea to keep him, kind of on that same path as Bruce Wayne, and end up having him become Batman at the end of the movie. I think it's a really cool thing that just also feeds into the theme of the overall trilogy as a whole. That Batman's a symbol to inspire, and it's not just one person. It can live on forever, and it just continue to be new people over and over again. And I think setting off Joseph Gordon-Levitt as the new Batman, while we don't ever see that, and I know there's a lot of people that are like, oh, he's Robin, but he's not Robin, he's Batman, and they want to see a fourth one. I don't think it's necessary. I think what it does and what it needed to do was just to set up that theme that Batman keeps going.
Okay. Well, yes, I understand what Nolan was setting up. I wouldn't have been opposed to getting a Nightwing movie, to be honest.
I wouldn't have been opposed to it either, but just like in the confines of the story, he wouldn't be Nightwing. He'd be Batman.
Yeah. Because everyone wanted him to be Nightwing, and they were setting him up to either pretty much go by Robin or to be the next Batman. Which, I mean, technically could just be Robin, even though in the comics Robin isn't technically known as being cool, even though I haven't read him, but everyone makes jokes about Robin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the comics either, but just to me, like, having him go back into the Batcave and, gain access to all the stuff, it's like he would take on the mantle of Batman and keep it going. That's just how I interpret it.
I mean, regardless, as a closing act to a trilogy, having that as your ending, like, I feel like you leave so excited and like it didn't even go to anything. Like it was just the way it was crafted just worked so well.
I mean, yeah, like the ending we can talk about it. Like I think this has got to be one of my favorite endings to a movie ever. Like it's just so good. The way the cross cutting when the bomb goes off and how they're reading out the will and the statue and everything. And it just comes full circle because, at the beginning of the movie, we get this story about Alfred, how in Batman Begins, he wanted Bruce to never come back to Gotham. And he wanted him to move on and get a new life and, see him in passing and just know that he made it. And then at the end of this film, that happens. Now, it's up to interpretation whether or not that's a dream sequence, because they do say that he did fix the autopilot, so he could have survived the nuclear blast. Or you could think that he actually did see Bruce with Catwoman and they just ran away and settled down and got a life. And I choose to believe that it's real. That's just me.
The way the movie's set up, it really can go both ways because Blake is there to pick the mantle up and, he's been ousted as Batman. Well, he technically has, but Gordon now knows. And so it's like, technically speaking, he left someone to take over the mantle. He's still got to be injured from, his leg on top of the being in the pit. So, and they
plus he got stabbed. So, yeah.
And then, they set up just a lot of things where it's like, yep, there's autopilot and all this stuff. So, it's totally possible. And I also in the camp, and I think that Nolan did Inception and really liked the way he ended that story. And he's like, I'm going to end it in the next one just like it.
Yeah, it's like, you're not going to know what happens. It's a good way to end movies. I think part of the reason why we talk about these movies so much and we talk about Nolan so much is because he makes endings like that where you can kind of interpret it multiple ways. Whereas if you make a movie and you have it be a definitive ending, that's the ending. There's no debate about it, and that's it. There's nothing to talk about. But in Inception, now you create this whole talking point. Everybody, when they leave the theater of Inception, is like, is he dreaming or is it real? And then we're talking, and then we're talking when we go to work. We're talking when we go to school. We're talking about the ending. Oh, you got to see it. Tell me what you think the ending is. And it's that word of mouth that just keeps going. Versus if you just had a definitive ending, you're like, oh, he's dreaming. Okay, whatever. And you just take it for granted. But that conversation just keeps the movie alive in spirit.
Yeah, and he's had this reputation of doing it, and then the only film he really didn't do with was Dunkirk, and obviously, I mean, it's a historically significant event. There
It
was
never
nothing.
happened.
There was nothing to do with that. But like then he did it with Tenet as well. But Tenet was set up in such a weird way, the way it was ending, where I'm like, is this going to a sequel? Because like it felt sequely, like the way like he wanted to do that same kind of ending, but instead it gave up like a sequel vibe.
Yeah, I got that vibe too.
And then going back into The Dark Knight Rises, though, the IMAX sequence with all the extras where they're about to brawl in the streets, that one stood out to me in IMAX because of just how much more detail you get with both the height and the resolution. Just having that much happening on screen, like that was intense.
Yeah, like definitely, because there's just so much going on, and they have like this wide open depth of field where you can see everything. For the shots when they're not doing Batman versus Bane, and just the way everything is shot in this film is beautiful. And they introduce another element to Gotham. It's snowing because we get like this long passage of time in the movie, and that just adds a whole nother level of beauty to the film. And yeah, it's really impressive to see what they were able to accomplish here with the cinematographer before he switched. This was the last movie he shot with his cinematographer before the cinematographer went on and wanted to direct his own movies, and then he got a new one starting with Interstellar. And so it's interesting to see like the kind of like visual change between those two films, or between like those two eras of Nolan.
Let's talk about Miranda Tate as a character. I felt she did a really good job hiding it. There wasn't, I mean, even rewatching it, she really doesn't give it away. Like sometimes when you watch films like this, you'll get a lot of hints at like something's happening, but
yeah,
I mean,
or once you
there's
like
not a lot.
Or like once you rewatch it, knowing it, you'd be like, "Oh, this was so obvious." But I think the reason why it takes you by surprise is because she's put in so many situations of peril where you're like, "Oh my gosh, they're like targeting her." But it's because she's in the know. And then rewatching it, every time they get tipped off, I realize it's because she's in the scene, and so I kind of like, "Oh, it makes sense now." Like when the people from like DC come in and they meet with her and then they immediately get gunned after, I'm like, oh,
right.
That's why. But yeah, it was really good, and the twist with her I didn't see coming, and just the whole backstory, because they play the backstory of the pit off, where it's really easy to believe that it's Bane, and then they give the reveal of Miranda Tate later on, and then you realize that Bane was the protector and not the child, and it's the way Nolan writes, and Nolan and his brother write. It's just lots of twists and turns. It's never just like it's never just right there in front of you. Like they always got to change something at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also, just rounding out the trilogy, Hans Zimmer, closing it out. It's not a rehash of the previous two movies. We still got lots of new things, and I think because we get a lot of time away from Batman when Batman first comes in, like 40 minutes or whatever into the film with that, and we first hear the Batman theme again, it just hits so much harder. And Bane's got his theme, Catwoman's even got like this delicate piano theme going on, and I think that's beautiful. And then the chant, with the pitch, they made this whole like I think the song's called Rise. It's like this anthem, and it's just so epic. And that scene in general, what it stands for. I don't want to get too far off the music, but let's hear your take on the music, and then I'll talk about the pit.
I really enjoy the music, and the music just works so well with the scenes. I mean, it's just like The Dark Knight, and just the way that the music brings it home. I mean, it's hard to even imagine if someone else had scored this movie, because Hans Zimmer's score in this movie, just like Pirates, is like so iconic that it's like you can't imagine it ever being replaced with other music. And like you said, when you hear that score for the first time, like 50 minutes in, I mean, yeah, it brings something else to like emotionally. And speaking of like when he first suits up, I think of that scene is just so cool when he comes in, and because that's when the argument between him and Alfred begins, is when he comes home after leading the chase.
Mm-hmm.
And like I just feel like it's so well executed.
Yeah, totally. Or like when he's first going out there and all the lights start going off in like the freeway or whatever, and then he shows up and then you hear the Batman theme. It's just so epic. But going back to the pit, we have that rise chant and it's so cool. And then there's so many parallels too, because then we get those flashbacks to when he fell in the well, and the dad's like, "Why do we fall? So we can pick ourselves back up." And it's just really smart writing. And then the fact that you don't have to you have to make the climb. Don't use the rope, because then it's the fear of death, and that's I guess what Bruce has to learn, is he has to learn to fear death, and realize that he has something to lose, and there's still something worth fighting for and worth giving for, and he ends up learning that and fighting with that fear of death until he realizes that like this is the call, that I gotta sacrifice my life to save the city.
That whole, because like as a whole, you don't see Batman fail very often in the Nolan trilogy. Like yes, he does, but it's very few times. And so the pit is kind of just like a moment of him failing miserably. I mean, he tries what, two times before he succeeds, but
Yeah.
like you get this, but it's not just the fact he fails twice. Like you get a sense that he is truly failing not only himself but also the city of Gotham, because you're also seeing the events unfold in Gotham, and he's seeing it through the TV, and he knows that it's not that it's his fault, but that he can't help them from where he is. And so it really just gives this overall vibe and mood to this scene.
Yeah, he's just helpless, and he has to sit there because he's wounded. He mentally isn't there, and then he's got to make the climb. We got a nice flashback with Liam Neeson as Ra's al Ghul that I thought was a nice addition, and it really adds like a lot of emotional weight to have Bruce stay there for a while. Like it's not like what other shows or movies do, where they get mortally wounded for like 5 minutes and then they're right back into it. No, we really sit on this and realize that he's out of the fight for a while, and then understand that like months go on.
Come on, dude. I loved Arrow Season 3's mid-season finale. I
I was
loved it
exactly.
so much.
That's the one I was referencing, dude.
The fact that he literally gets stabbed,
Through
presumed
the
dead,
chest
and then
falls forever.
and then end of episode 10, he's alive again. I was just like, I'm insulted.
I know, that was so terrible. I was like, no shot, he's back already.
The thing about killing characters is that if you specifically show them being killed, and you come up with like a really, really cheap way that they survived, it's really aggravating, because there's a difference between Jon Snow's death, and then there's a difference between Glenn's death that first time around.
Oh my god.
When he hit under a trash can, like, I don't know, when you get like thrown a curveball and it's not even a good one, like it's more annoying. Where like at least with Jon Snow, I think he stayed dead for like 2 full episodes. The Game of Thrones episodes are long.
Yeah, it was a while.
And like you also had to wait like a year between the season, and he only got brought back by a supernatural element. Like it wasn't anything cheap where like, oh, they were fake blades. Like something like that I feel like it would be aggravating, and a lot of movies and shows like to do that, and I absolutely hate it.
Yeah, and in the confines of Game of Thrones, the way he came back made sense. Just putting it out there.
Well, if we're going to talk about deaths that make no sense, let's talk about Kingsman.
Okay.
The second one.
Okay, we're not getting into that. We already talked about Kingsman. But also going back to the movie, when I rewatched it, this is to me it's low key the funniest one of the three. I don't know if that's just me, but it feels like it, especially like the first half. I don't know why.
Funniest?
Yeah, like there's just some one-liners that are just like I don't know. It's like when he's like taking Catwoman back home and he's like, you gotta stay away, and then he turns around and then he turns back, she's gone. He's like, so that's what that feels like. I don't know. It's just like hella meta.
Yo, everyone when this movie first came out made fun of the fact that like he turns back around, she's gone, and he continues to use his Batman voice. Like she's
I
not
know.
even there anymore. He's just doing it cuz.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also funny, like, that out of, like, how smart she is, she doesn't really know until, like, he fights Bane, right? Like, because Bane's like, Mr. Wayne. And she's like, oh shit, I just sent him to die.
I mean, it's kind of cool how that unfolds because you can see in her face that she didn't know. Like she had
Yeah.
no clue too. It's not like she had suspicions. Like she literally had no idea
Yeah.
because the last time she saw him was first she saw him as a cripple, then she saw him at a party, and then that's it.
Right. And they talk about, I have a powerful friend, or he's like, I got Bruce working on this. And he's like, oh, my powerful friend's doing this, you know? So they play like this duality thing. And then you see if she's like, oh, I just sent Batman to fight or whatever. And then the door closes and then she sees he's going to fight Bane. And she's like, oh, holy crap, I just killed him.
Yeah, and that's one of the coolest IMAX switches of all time.
Yeah.
When the gate shuts and it immediately just switches the eye. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I'm sorry. There's certain times when an IMAX, like a switch, just really gets me going. I'm like, oh, that
It
was
gets you going.
so beautifully shot.
Yeah, but I mean, this movie definitely, despite everything it had stacked against it, it succeeded financially like crazy. Like this is the highest grossing Batman movie of all time, and I mean, I know there's a lot of anticipation for the Batman next year, but I don't think it's gonna pass this. Personally, I'm just saying right now, I don't think it
I'm
is.
gonna go on a limb here and say it's probably gonna make somewhere between 5 and 700 million. And the reason I say this is that the highest grossing movie that's like, popular here and overseas is Fast and Furious 9 and that capped out at 700 million. Now granted this was this past summer, but it's not like we're seeing Dune or anything crossing 500 million. So the next best thing we can look at is No Time to Die. And I mean, we'll see in December when Spider-Man No Way Home comes out on what future movies are really going to look like because No Way Home has a lot of hype around it, and so we'll
Right.
see if it can pull in some numbers. Because if not, I don't know. I think the movie itself will be really good because it's Matt Reeves, but I still think there's a lot of people who are kind of iffy on Robert Pattinson as Batman.
Yeah, I do think the second trailer did a lot to help it, and also we got the same cinematographer as Dune, and so it's looking like a beautiful film. The only thing I don't know about it is it going to be rated R? Because that could hurt it as well.
Uh, well, Joker made $1 billion and it was rated R.
I
So
know, but that was pre-pandemic.
I'm gonna go on a limb and say because it's Matt Reeves and he's just been doing PG-13 lately, that we are probably looking at a PG-13, but like just very very close to R, just like The Dark Knight.
That's
It
what I
does
think
look
too.
really
Yeah,
dark.
yeah,
Now, if it's rated R, I'll be beyond excited because just the prospect of having an R-rated Batman movie just
right.
sounds insane.
Yeah,
But you also have to just realize that for Warner Brothers, no matter how good Matt Reeves is, there's no way that they're going into this saying that there's no risk.
right.
Like this is a super big, high budget movie. Like it's like Batman Begins was only successful because it had such a small budget compared to later entries in the Dark Knight trilogy. And I mean, even today, we've now had another Batman, and yet people still compare Batman, like they're comparing Robert Pattinson to Christian Bale's Batman, because for a lot of people, Ben Affleck just wasn't their Batman. And granted, Ben Affleck also had a very short run as Batman, to be honest.
Right, and he didn't get like a solid like individual shot at it. Um, but I don't think you have to make a Batman movie rated R. It's not like a Deadpool or like a Logan where like that character really demands that rating. You know, Dark Knight and even aspects of this movie at sometimes kind of push that boundary, and I think you can do that as a PG-13, or even stuff we've seen in Venom. You can come pretty close to that line without crossing into R, and it still be very dark and gritty. So I think the Batman should be just fine.
See, and that works until you get to Venom 2, because I felt like Venom 2 was so lame as a PG-13 movie. Like, it had to, I feel like because of its theming, they had to pull back on the things they were able to do in the first one. It just felt so, it felt like it was trying to appeal to like a smaller group, like demographically, and yet its like topics were heavier, and so it was kind
Yeah,
of
I
just
feel
like a
that.
weird mix.
I feel that.
And so
I
with
don't
an
know.
R-rated Batman, I don't know, it would have to be done really well
Right.
in
I'm
order
just
to
saying it's
pull
not
it off.
necessary.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, no.
Yeah. So, this movie with its whatever box office, I know you know the number, is the goal, is the limit. We'll see if the Batman can even come close.
I think it's a good limit though, because Batman is, at least looking at the Dark Knight trilogy, it was a very domestic heavy release. It's not to say that it made more than half its money domestically, but when you're looking at 40 to 50% of its box office numbers coming just domestically, I mean, it's impressive because most movies nowadays are topping out 20-30% in the US. So it still has a very big demographic here. So to hit, $1 billion, it means it has to make $400 million in the US alone.
Right. And, I don't want to keep speculating on the Batman because I'm sure we're going to do an episode on that. But rounding out The Dark Knight Rises, I think it's a solid end to the trilogy. Really cements the themes that the trilogy set up. Has some great action sequences. It's a beautiful looking film. Hans Zimmer's got a perfect score. Christopher Nolan, he's 3 for 3 with these movies for me. This is one of my favorite trilogies of all time, and I think this one, it's not my favorite because of course it's not The Dark Knight, but it's definitely not terrible. I still think this is a great movie. It's definitely in like my mid pack of Nolan films.
Yeah, all three of them are excellent movies, and if you ever get a chance to either see this in IMAX or pick it up on a 4K Blu-ray, I mean, this movie is absolutely gorgeous. And this is the one time where I have to tell people who are on digital, don't watch these movies on digital. I don't care how cheap they are. Go and watch it on a regular Blu-ray disc for all I care, because you don't get the IMAX footage on the digital copies of this movie at all. Nowhere.
Absolute
There's no way to
travesty.
see it. Yeah, the only way to see the IMAX footage is on a Blu-ray disc, Blu-ray or 4K Blu-ray, not DVD either.
Right, because Nolan's the man.
Yeah, and I wish more directors and studios would release this IMAX footage so that we'd have more movies to compare and get to say, well, this one was like this. Like,
We're
all
talking
we get
to you,
do,
Kevin.
all we get to do is sit here and try and remember how great the IMAX was in the film, but now there's no reference to it anymore because it was so long ago.
Praying we get it for Dune.
We didn't get it for Blade Runner, so I'm gonna.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I gotta hope. that crap was juicy, man. But anyway, that's gonna do it for us. We'll be back next week. I have no idea what we're talking about next week. We'll figure it out.
We are talking about Eternals next week.
Oh, yeah, I'm stupid. I totally forgot. Yeah, we're seeing Eternals, guys. Talking about it, spoiler free. Is it as crappy as the Rotten Tomatoes score reflects, or is it the next
really hope not.
Man of Steel? We'll break it down for you next week. But anyways, this has been me and Anthony. We'll see you guys next week.
See you guys. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Timebreaker Podcast.
If you did enjoy it, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe, and make sure to ring that notification bell for new episodes every Wednesday.
See you next week.